Hi, my name is John Kelsey. I'm National Trainer for Hard Hat Industry Solutions. This is a session from Red Rhino Academy, our complete training course in electrical and structured cabling estimating using Red Rhino software. Welcome to our session on using the recap for a competitive advantage. If you do not already know how to use Red Rhino estimating software to create an estimate, please refer to the session called Setting Up Red Rhino first before moving ahead with the session. This session is applicable to both electrical and structured cabling estimating. The purpose of estimating and bidding work, of course, is to make a profit. In order to make a profit, you must first know the cost of the project. Once you establish the cost of a project in an estimate, you add a profit margin or markup in order to make money. In this session, we cover how to change your markup in the recap to increase your probability of winning the bid. What is a recap? The recap is a page in Red Rhino with a cost summary displaying all costs associated with your estimate. The recap allows you to adjust the profit margins of each estimate component. It's used after entering your material takeoff and before creating your proposal. Now I will demonstrate what I explained about recap using Red Rhino estimating software. For this training segment, we'll start at the home page and we'll begin with the assumption that you've already created an estimate with all the takeoff entries completed. From the home page, we'll go to the Estimate and Proposal box and click List Estimates. This takes us to the Estimate List page where all estimates are stored in Red Rhino. Next, I select the estimate we will use for this session. I created an estimate for this training session called How to Be Competitive Using the Recap. This takes us to the estimate. At the top you see the word Estimate and to the right a row of buttons. Below the buttons you see the name of the estimate. The estimate information is self-explanatory. At the bottom left are names of two sections, one section called Base Bid and the other called Warehouse Lighting. In this estimate, we're imagining the customer asked for a separate price to install lighting fixtures in the warehouse. Next, I click Recap, which takes us to the Recap page. Now for a quick overview of the recap. As explained earlier, the recap displays a summary of the estimate and shows a cost breakdown of the total project. Before you send your price off to your customer, you review the recap to evaluate the total costs and labor hours and make adjustments to the estimate as necessary. This training segment shows you how to be more competitive by demonstrating how to adjust your estimate using the recap. Starting at the top, the recap allows you to change the markup of overhead and profit. It also allows you to set the sales tax to match those required in your area of the country. In this example, the overhead is set at 10% and the profit is also set at 10%. These values are for training purposes only, are not to be construed as values you should use. Red Rhino will mark up everything 10% for overhead and another 10% for profit based on what you set here in the recap. It will mark up all labor costs, the price of materials, quoted materials, expenses, everything. The tax percent is set at 8.25%. Again, this value is for training purposes. Your area sales tax may differ. The crew rate is set at $42 per hour. To explain how it works, the recap displays all costs listed in the estimate. The recap displays the value for several categories. The recap shows the material and quotes including tax amount at $28,368. Let me say that again, it's actually $28,364. I'll circle it here. It displays the total price input for expenses. which is $5,768. And for subcontracts, it's $6,420. Further down on the recap displays the total cost of the estimate. It is displayed as prime cost, which is $40,552. Now it's important to understand that the prime cost here is the cost of your project, and Red Rhino will mark it up, or it will add markup to that prime cost to come up with the total price. Since this estimate is set to mark up items at 10% overhead and 10% profit, Red Rhino shows those amounts on the recap below prime cost. There's your prime cost. And there's the markup that Red Rhino applied to each category. In other words, Red Rhino displays the prime cost of the estimates and then adds markup to each category to arrive at the total price. For this example, you can see that each category displays markup of 10 and 10. Near the bottom of the recap, it displays the total overhead and profit in dollars. There you see the total overhead and profit is $8,516. So Red Rhino arrives at the total by adding the markup to the prime cost. The total in this example is $49,067. When you change the markup, of course, it changes the total estimated amount. Next, I will show you how to change the markup to be more competitive. There are two ways you can set the markup of values in Red Rhino. The first way is to change the markup at the top of the recap, which when changed or adjusted will mark up everything in the entire estimate. To do so, you simply click the Edit Header button at the top right of the page. It allows you to edit or change the values at the top of the recap. You can adjust the overhead and profit here, and it changes the markup for the entire estimate. Of course, when you change the markup, you change the total estimated price. It goes without saying that when you reduce the markup, it reduces the total amount or the total price. Once you've changed the values, you click Save to save your settings. You can also fine-tune your adjustments to the markup. Next, I'll demonstrate how to make these adjustments. To make the fine-tune adjustments, click the button at the right that says Edit Items. Rhino will open up dialog boxes at the bottom right of the page and allow values in those boxes to be edited. Again, prime cost is the total cost of the estimate. Red Rhino adds the markup to prime cost to calculate the total of the project. Below prime cost now, you'll see material, labor, overhead percent, quotes overhead percent, expenses overhead percent, subcontracts overhead percent, material, labor, overhead profit, quotes profit, expenses profit, and subcontracts profit. On the right is where you mark them up. On the left is the description there that I just explained. Over on the right there, you can change each individual category. You can mark it down to make your bid more competitive. In this estimate, you'll notice that there are quoted materials entered into each section. It's shown above as quoted materials including tax. In this sample estimate, the total amount of quoted materials as shown in the total column is $10,392. There's $7,145 of quoted materials in the base bid section, and $3,248 in the warehouse lighting section. Again, for the total of $10,392. Since the markup values at the top of the recap are set at 10 and 10, that is 10% overhead and 10% profit, those are values shown for the markup for the quotes percent and quotes profit percent. You may elect to reduce the markup for quoted materials to be more competitive. You can change the markup by changing the quote's overhead percent and changing the quote's profit percent values. Doing this will reduce the total dollar value of the estimate or the dollar amount of the estimate, making your price more competitive. As an example, you may want to change the total markup percent of quotes to a total of 10%. I'll show you how to do this now. I'll click in the quotes overhead percent box and change the value to 5 for 5%. So I'm going to change the quotes overhead percent to 5 in each section. Then I change the quotes profit percent to 5% in each section. Once the changes are saved, Red Rhino will apply the new values to the estimate and change the total price. Of course, if you reduce the markup percent, it will reduce the total price. To save the changes, scroll up to the top, click the Save Items button at the top of the right top of the page. To reiterate, the categories in which the markup can be changed are material and labor overhead percent, quotes overhead percent, expenses overhead percent, subcontracts overhead percent, and then the profit percents are material and labor, quotes, expenses, and subcontracts. You may choose to make markup changes in one category or several, depending on your pricing strategy. Making changes to any category works the same as I just demonstrated in material quotes. Notice that by reducing the markup for quoted materials, the total price was reduced from $49,067 to $47,950. By reducing the markup on select categories, you make your price more competitive. Now I want to explain something very important. Once you drill down and change the settings for various categories lower in the recap, if you go back to the top and change the settings in the recap, Rhino will override the settings or the changes you made in the lower portion of the recap. Let me say it again. Make sure you set the markup at the top of the page first. Once you drill down and change the settings for the various categories lower in the recap, if you go back and change the settings at the top of the recap, Rhino will override those settings at the bottom of the recap. With this, we conclude our training session on using the recap for a competitive advantage. In this session, we've seen how to change the markup from a recap to be more competitive. This is John Kelsey saying goodbye for now. Thanks for joining me in this session of Red Rhino Academy.